All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to All About Pedro Almodovar. Arguably, I would say definitely the most famous Spanish director, and by that I mean Spanish director from Spain. Because if we're talking Spanish language director, or Guillermo del Toro is also in the mix. Also Alfonso Cuarón. Um, but those are, I think, both del Toro and Cuarón hail from Mexico, rather, whereas Almodovar is from Spain. Um, just to give a little background of how I got into Pedro Almodovar. Being a young movie nerd, I was right. My dad would bring home Entertainment Weekly things from his office, and I would start to read like movie reviews and the best of the year. And in the 1999 issue, one of the best movies of the year was this little film called All About My Mother. And I was like, "Oh, what's this about?" And I'm like, "Oh, this sounds interesting. I don't know if I get it," but my thought process was, well, if this is on the best of the year list and getting nominated for Oscars, I should certainly see it. And lo and behold, about a year later, the library, my local library stores had All About My Mother on disc. I brought it home and watched it and fell in love with Pedro Almodovar right then and there. And tried to see as many of his movies as possible. Not exactly easy in like the early aughts, but once I discovered piracy, that helped, despite the fact that it ruined at least one of my parents' computers. Um, but in the early aughts, I became a fan of Pedro and would seek out pretty much anything he had made after that. And luckily, being in college, the library had some of his older stuff. So I was able to see movies like Woman on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. And then being in New York, I was able to go to the theater to see Talk to Her. No, I didn't see Talk to Her, but I was able to go to the theater to see Bad Education and later Voltaire. So I have been a fan of him for over 20 years at this point. I think he's a director that's fairly well known in the United States, but still he's not on the level of, say, like a Martin Scorsese, but I think he should be, and I adore his work, and I've loved seeing his work evolve as I've been watching his movies. So if you're not entirely familiar with who Pedro Almodovar is and you just came because you're like, Liz is talking about him, I may as well give this a shot. He's a writer and director of over 20 films. He's been making movies since the 70s. Um, his well-known films are All About My Mother, Voltaire, Bad Education, and Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. And you can see him with two fairly recognizable stars, Antonio Banderas and Penelope Cruz, both of whom fall under the category of his muses. Like a lot of very well-known and very more auteur directors, they have a stable of actors that they like to use, and both Penelope and Antonio are a part of that. So, where did Pedro Almodovar come from? I mentioned earlier he is from Spain. He was born September 25th in 1949. I saw a few places put 1951, but the more credible publications I saw put 49. In, I hope I don't butcher this, Calzada de Calatrava in La Mancha, Spain. If you remember, La Mancha sounds familiar. Don Quixote, Man in La Mancha. And he grew up fairly if you watch a lot of his work, they take place in mostly cities, very urban areas. That's not where he grew up. He grew up wanting to be in those places. And his background, his dad was a mule driver, and his mother, they took care of him in the household. He grew up in a very female-centered area. His mom did do a lot of odd jobs, and one of them was reading letters to other people. Because not everyone was literate, and his mother was. And he talks about how being surrounded by women really influenced his work. I loved this quote where he goes, "I prefer to work with women. Maybe that's because when I was young, I was surrounded by strong women, real fighters. This was La Mancha, a very machista and conservative region." There was another quote where he talked about it, where he was like, "It's a very testicular type of region." But he says there the man is the king sitting on the throne, and the women are like the prime minister. They're the ones who govern the house, resolve the problem. Um, it made me think of, there's this moment in Big Fat Greek Wedding where the mother's like, "Oh, the father is the head, but the mother is the neck, and she can turn." And if you do watch a lot of his films that do deal with some of the more rural areas, there is this ongoing theme of women being the ones who truly have the strength. They're the ones who, there's a network. They're the ones you can depend on to keep everybody fed, to keep everybody clothed, to handle all of the crises that are constantly happening. And of course, they're all eccentric. But he moved from La Mancha when he was 9 to Madrigalejo in Extremadura, which is West Spain. Should have just said that. And he grew up in Catholic boarding schools, and his the intention to prepare him for a career in the church was not his. There's a really good New Yorker piece from 2016 where he talked about being raised with that, and he's just like, I absolutely did not want to work in the, be a part of this, to the point where having to kiss the ring during communion was something that disgusted him. And knowing what we know about the Catholic Church and some of the abuse, that takes on a darker tone in one of his later films, which we'll get to. But he did love movies. As he put it, goes, the religion he had were these booklets that had illustrations and classical photos of movie stars. And he's just like, he kind of looked at that and was like, oh, this is my God now. And as he got a little older, his brother Augustine, who's also a business partner, they would start going to movies. So in where they lived, there wasn't a classic cinema house. There would be movie theaters, but there would also be just theaters projected on the side of buildings where you'd have to bring your own lawn chairs, or you'd sit on the ground and just watch movies. It would be a communal activity. So there, he's like, we would see everything from spaghetti westerns, like the ones that influenced Quentin Tarantino, to movies like by Louis Brunel, Ingmar Bergman. So he got a very well-rounded cinema history, cinema diet, watching movies screened onto the side of a wall. Also, it's worth noting, we'll get to this a little later, but when he was born still under the dictatorship of Franco, which was a very authoritarian regime, which, as he talked about when he was younger, didn't really cross his mind because he had no other frame of reference. But as he got older, he started to feel the effects of the more repressive aspects of General Franco. So he finally goes to Madrid in 1967. As he puts it, he told his father he wanted to make movies. His father was going to turn him into the National Guard to be conscripted into service. And Pedro's like, well, I just left home after that. He doesn't talk too much about his relationship with his father. He talks about his mother a lot. I just gathered by everything that was written and kind of unsaid that he probably never had a great relationship with his father after that. So he goes to Madrid, which is at the time kind of a hip happening, and still is, rural area. And this is a story we hear from a lot of creatives, leaving the more rural, probably fairly repressive and, in their mind, boring area for like the big bright city, and we're gonna make it. And he wanted to go to film school. He wanted to make movies from a very young age, but the school he wanted to go to was closed by Franco. And that was because Franco saw film schools, art schools, and places of higher education in general as just dens of Marxist and leftist indoctrination. So he actually never had a formal film education. And I have a quote from, this is, if you've ever seen All About My Mother, this is on the Criterion Collection's website. It's from the essay that goes along with that film. And it says, quote, Almodovar was lucky, perhaps, that Franco decided to close the film school he'd wished to attend. He did not have to waste his time struggling with his teachers. Instead, he taught himself. He bought a Super 8 camera with his first paycheck, and he showed his films wherever he could. His work was different from that of his contemporaries. Almodovar told stories while others made vague, arty, and conceptual films. From the minute he began, no matter how small the venue, he would make people roar with laughter. Among the Super 8 people, he stood out as too populist, but once he began to make feature-length films, and he made his first while still working at the telephone company, he stood out from other Spanish filmmakers who were still obsessed with the Civil War. So he pretty much hit the ground running in terms of being a creative. I mean, as I said there, he worked for a telephone company. He had to do something to make money. He also tried acting for a bit. As he put it, he goes, I wasn't that good at it. I got cast in a few productions. But the good thing that came out of that was where he met one of his first big players and arguably his first muse, Carmen Maura, who we will get to later. And he, again, bought a Super 8 camera, started shooting movies. He shot short films. They were very bohemian in their style in a way. And as he puts it, not exactly technically great, but there's passion behind it. And that's an ongoing thing in his film. So the two earliest film he made were The Fall of Sodom in 1975 and Sex Comes and Sex Goes, which are, they deal with sexuality, they deal with relationships, they're comedies. Pedro loves to have comedy in his movies. Sadly, as he puts it, he goes, these films just don't exist anymore. He said he still has the film strips, but they are so damaged they can't be restored. And that that happens, sadly. I always think that's a tragedy when first films are not found, but we still have his more proper debut in the 1980s. And so when he was starting to make films and kind of work in the art scene, it was part of this larger movement called La Movida, which you could say kind of similar to punk. It was pretty, I would say, a direct response to Franco's death. So Franco died in the mid 70s. And with that, it was as if a cloud was lifted. So people like, oh, we can be artistic, we can be expressive again. So punk was a response to somewhat of the more Todd, what would you call punk a response to? I'm kind of losing my train of thought right now. For in terms of Britain, at the very least, the more repressive, button down,
At the risk of a bad
aesthetic.
cliche term, the establishment.
Yes. I was about to say a response to Thatcher, but punk does predate Thatcher. And to be fair, in Britain, some of the punk acts, notably the Sex Pistols, I mean, not all punk acts, but something like the Sex Pistols, that was more of a commercialized version of punk, but there was other punk stuff that was a response to that was more authentic response. Or if we're talking in America, punk movements like the Ramones, they weren't necessarily a response to the establishment, they were a response to the more conceptual and, you know, long-winded songs by stuff like Led Zeppelin. But there was also but for Spain, it was a response to decades and decades and decades of repression. I would actually say a similar film, I don't know if I know enough to give it a name, but if anyone's familiar with Taiwan, like somewhat the Taiwanese film landscape, Taiwan was also a fairly repressive society until the late 80s. And that's when you had, once that became, Taiwan became more democratic and more of a free society. I really hope I'm explaining this well. You had directors like Edward Yang and Hao Hai-sen. As they saw it, we can finally tell the truth in our films. Edward Yang, I believe, said directly, his film A Brighter Summer Day could not have been made in the more um, repressive society that it takes place in. So we were seeing, this is something we see in a number of countries throughout history with cinema and with art in general. Um, it's a response to someone telling you no. But as opposed to some other Spanish creatives, Almodovar never really addressed Franco in his work until very recently. And he was criticized for it and asked about it. And in some case, he just was kind of like, it's not something I want to make. So if you are not familiar with Franco in Spain, just to put, Francisco Franco was a dictator that ruled Spain until 1975. And as with many dictatorships, people disappeared. This was not just not a free society, it was one where people could just be wiped away if they were not quote unquote cooperative enough. And as with a lot of these regimes, talk about sexuality is something that's not okay. The idea of a nuclear family being the only correct family is something that's reinforced. As I mentioned earlier, Franco closed the art schools because he's like, oh, people are getting indoctrinated there. So, and again, this is something where we see not just in Spain, it's pattern. But that is something that he never addressed, and some of it was he felt that he didn't want to. Um, he didn't want to. He's like, I want to make people laugh. I want to tell fun stories. And the Franco regime isn't fun. And I have this quote here from an interview where he goes, I have to confess, I sort of forgot about my political leanings and dedicated myself to literally enjoying the things denied to me. Again, being able to make movies that very openly discuss sex and sexuality, characters that are queer and it not being much of a taboo is something he had very early on in his films. So, and again, I think it should go without saying, if you have seen a film by Pedro Almodovar, you can tell his political leanings very quickly. The man is not subtle. Uh, so the sorry, he finally addresses Franco after over 40 years of making films in 2001's Parallel Mothers, which is actually one of my favorite Almodovar films. I think there's still some people who are mixed on it. Um, but the plot of this film, it starts with Penelope Cruz's character contacting an archaeologist who is trying to find unmarked mass graves of citizens who were disappeared by the regime. And she is trying to find it her I think it is either her great uncle or her great grandfather. And there is a conversation she has with another character late in the film where it's a younger character who is saying, well, I don't know why we're constantly thinking about the past. We need to look to the future. And Penelope Cruz's character is like, we can't just turn away from this. And she actually tells this girl, she's like, if your father keeps saying we need to forget this past, you might want to look into who your family supported decades ago. It's, I would say, a very great film that is about confronting the past, and not only that, it is this story runs parallel with a more personal story between Penelope Cruz and another woman in the film. This idea of the truth cannot be buried; it has to come out. And I don't want to spoil too much of that movie because I do love it, and it was. I went in not knowing too much of what it was about. Just, oh, Pedro Almodovar's making a movie with Penelope Cruz again. I'm in. And it was a really great film to kind of watch these two storylines unfold. And if you want to read more just an interview and a discussion on this, there is a good article in The Guardian called Pedro Almodovar on Spain's Tragic Past. You can't ask people to forget. And I think this idea of confronting the past is a pretty universal topic for a number of countries, but I would highly recommend watching Parallel Mothers. But yeah, it is something that a lot of people point out in his filmography is how Franco is, for the most part, notably absent. So moving on to that, what are his themes and style? What does Pedro like to have in his films? Well, as I discussed before, sex, desire, relationships, that's all something you're going to find in every Pedro Almodovar movie. There is a frankness to his sexuality in films, which when I was a little younger, a little shocking to me. I was like, oh, he also, identity is a part of it, but it's also people of queer identity are always a part of his films. I think between All About My Mother and Boys Don't Cry, that was how I learned transgender people even existed. But as opposed to a film like Boys Don't Cry, which is about a hate crime and a tragedy, with Pedro Almodovar films, I wouldn't say there's never tragedy, but they are characters that are just allowed to exist. They exist within the story, and I mean, you could always argue their inclusion is political, especially in the wake of coming out of a repressive regime. But let's just take his film Laws of Desire, for example. Carmen Mora plays a transgender woman. You could have a conversation about her casting as she's cisgender, but her character isn't there to be a statement on transgender people. She's just the main character's sister. And it's actually one where I watch it and she's broken up with her girlfriend, but her girlfriend kind of left her daughter there under the care of the sister. And it's just like, I just watch it, I'm like, man, if this movie made in like the 1980s was released today, somebody would be having a fit about a transgender woman being seen as a caregiver for a child. But it just, her character is just exists. She is just another character. Her gender, her transition isn't her only defining feature. Um, there is history is a part of it, but the trauma of the past is something he explores more. He explores that more in the microcosm sense. So the film Vauvert is about Penelope Cruz's character kind of confronting stuff that happened to her in the past. Same with films like Bad Education. I guess the best way to sum it up as I put here, it's social commentary under the guise of melodrama. And that's why I think his films are so good, because they're subversive. It's a, you think you're getting kind of a light, fluffy, almost poppy comedy, or in some cases a thriller or a romantic film or a film about desire, but you're kind of getting a lot of stuff in there where it's like, oh, this is a little more political than I thought. And what's his style? Um, Off the top of my head, if you were asking me to describe a Pedro Almodovar film, I would say color. His films are very colorful. They're also impeccably directed. Todd, you said this a little while back. There's always been the discussion of what movie apartment would you love to have, and a lot. Todd, you what did you say about the apartments?
I know I'm trying which director is the initial comparison, but I can't go like, no, I want to live in an Almodovar apartment.
I
Those
think
are
it was a Nancy Meyer. Everyone talked like, oh, Nancy Meyer apartments are great. But you're like, no, I want to live in a Pedro. I'm with you. I'm like, I want to live in a Pedro Almodovar apartment or a house. These look cool and cozy and eclectic, and they look lived. Actually, something I love about the set design for all of his films is they all look lived in. Which is, there's a sterility sometimes that I see in American films that kind of irks me a bit, but his movies always look very the set design's very intimate. Uh and speaking of intimate, there's intimate cinematography. Something I've noticed watching a lot of his films is he likes to focus on embraces. Sometimes the camera will come in when you see two characters embrace, or for one of the films I just watched that I hadn't seen before, the Flower of My Secret, there's a point in the film where two characters embrace and you see them surrounded by a whole bunch of other people. It's a beautiful shot, but even surrounded by others, you still get the idea that they are having a moment of connection and comfort. You also see a little bit of crossovers with his other movies. Flower of My Secret inspired not one but two other films. If you've seen Voltaire and All About My Mother, go back and watch Flower of My Secret. You'll be like, oh, these are the genesis of other films. And if you saw his short film with Tilda Swinton, The Human Voice, he is one to, and go back and watch Laws of Desire, and you'll see, oh, Pedro Almodovar has wanted to adapt the human voice for almost 40 years. And finally, overstuffed plots, which is a criticism a lot of people have of Pedro. Going back to the example of Parallel Mothers, they're like, well, we have the main story here of Penelope Cruz and this younger woman, two women that gave birth at the same hospital on the same day, and their connection to each other. Why do we need this whole other story of Penelope Cruz trying to find the grave of her and her ancestors who were disappeared by General Franco? Well, number one, again, those two stories connect to each other in the larger theme. But number two, Pedro has kind of said, like, in life, there is never one single story. You always have other things happening around you. So his films always have this idea of, yes, there's a big A plot, but there's a B plot, a C plot, a D plot, and it's just coming in and out of your movie. And something I've noticed watching a lot of his films is the first half, you kind of see a lot of different threads, and they all either not quite go away, but they're phased out, where by the second half of the film, you are focusing on the A plot. And then by the end of the film, everything just comes together again. It's a very specific style he has, and it's very hard to juggle a bunch of different plot balls, but he always manages to do it very well. So the 1980s. So after he made his Super 8 debut, he makes his formal debut with Pepe Le Chibon in 1980. And that is a film that was made over the course of almost a year because he could only shoot it on weekends because he was working. And if you watch Pepe Lucci Vaughn, you look at the camera work, you look at some of the styling, you're like, the styling has a very punk vibe to it. Camera work, you're like, as with a lot of first features, definitely needs some work. But it's one of those, if you watch it, you're just like, I can see why this guy got big in Spain very quickly. It was something that a lot of people really gravitated towards. But he didn't Matador is I would say Matador is really good if you want to see a young, very attractive baby-faced Antonio Banderas. But his first kind of big breakout movie was Laws of Desire. In 1987, as I've already referenced that one, great movie. Antonio Banderas is in it. It's a much darker role for him. Carmen Mora is in it. She's fantastic. That is actually a movie that made her a queer icon in Spain, not just because she was in Pedro Almodovar's films, but at the time, because she played a transgender woman and it was a very well-rounded and sympathetic portrayal of a transgender woman, she became very well renowned in the trans community for that portrayal. In 1988, we have Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, which is his real big breakout point. So when he first made his movies, they had the reputation of, oh, it's sex, it's gender, it's pushing the boundaries. Interestingly enough, though Almodovar is gay himself, although he identified as bisexual for a very long time, he eventually was just like, nah, I'm gay. He would never cast himself as a gay director. And he actually says, he goes like, he says, this is from an interview I have where with Filmmaker magazine, where it says you raise the issue of morality. You often seem caught between different political agendas here. For example, gay groups have condoned you for not continually making gay films or for not providing good images, and feminists sometimes attacked you for violence. And this is him more on homosexuality. He goes, homosexuality in films is understood very differently here as in the United States, than it is understood in Spain. In Spain, we don't differentiate movies with homosexuals from movies without. In Spain, there isn't really a gay community. Here, things are much, here, as in here in America, things are much more divided. In my films, homosexuals are a part of the film, but no more. There's no political posture or position on their part or my part. I'm only talking about characters that are alive and who form a part of my films in the same way that they form a part of society. So, and again, that's why I think there are a lot of gay people that do like his films because they don't feel as if there's constantly a message there. But again, all viewpoints are valid. So, I mentioned Carmen Mora, also Cecilia Roth, Rossi De Palma, Antonio Banderas. They kind of became a stable of actors, and at some point they were compared to like Warhol's clique. Sorry, lost my train of thought. Carmen Mora would come in to kind of save him a couple times. So at the bottom, he had to work with other financiers and producers. And one producer for Dark Habits, they're like, cast my girlfriend, or no, it was cast his wife. That role was initially the lead. And so what he did was he just rewrote the part and is like, well, this is a small part now. Carmen Mora is now the lead of that film. And then another producer for another film said, oh, you got to write out this character. So he talks about, he says, before I used to work with many different producers, up to my sixth film, and then my brother and I formed a production company. Because in Spain, the usual way to finance is with subsidiaries from the Ministry of Culture, with pre-sales to television. When I discovered the producer was nothing more than an administrative clerk who took my script to different offices, we figured we could do that ourselves. Now my films are produced by El Desio, Desire, which is our company, and he has had El Desio has been his production company since 1985, and Laws of Desire was, I believe, the first film that he completely made independently, which if you watch it you're like, oh yeah, I can see that. But and if you still watch any of his films today, like even his short movie that came out last year, El Desio is still its production company. But really, I can't beat around the bush without talking about Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. While Laws of Desire got him a good amount of attention on the international stage, Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown was a watershed moment, and this is the true breakout movie for him. Released in 1988, it won 5 Goya Awards, which in Spain, that's the equivalent of the Academy Award there, including Best Film, Best Actress for Carmen Mora, and this is what made him a director that became in demand, not just in Spain, but worldwide. So, what is this movie about? Kamamura plays a woman named Peppa. Her lover leaves her, and she tries to figure out why. And just comedy ensues. Is the best way to describe this. Would you agree, Todd?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Again, this is one where I don't know how many people who are at this program have seen his film, so I don't want to spoil them for you. But his film, there is a mix of melodrama and screwball comedy to this movie, and it is blended so seamlessly well. I don't know, I would put it under one of the best comedies ever made. It's a lot of fun. Sadly, though, this put him on the map internationally. This also put Carmen Mora on the map as an actress that was a lot more in demand as well. But behind the scenes, this was the last film he would make with Carmen for almost 20 years. I have never been entirely clear as to what happened. Um, and neither Pedro or Carmen have ever been entirely forthright as to what led to the falling out. The most more Carmen has said is he's very controlling to work with, very authoritarian. And that's true for a lot of directors. They're very clear about what they want. When Pedro talked about it, he just said like, I'm very sad. They had worked together on a lot of movies. Maybe it was something shooting this movie was very hard and difficult. Maybe it was one where they finally just got sick of working together. I have never been able to truly find a clear answer as to what happened, except for they just said professional differences. But she would return for one film in the aughts. So we're moving on to the 90s. Pedro Almodovar becomes a big hit. He becomes a big name. He actually gets an offer to direct a Sister Act with Whoopi Goldberg, and he turns it down, which, Todd, what do you think? Good decision?
Yeah, I don't know if I can picture that. I'm gonna be
Yeah,
honest.
well, here's the thing. I think Sister Act is a great movie. I would be very interested to see the parallel universe where Pedro Almodovar's Sister Act exists. I I actually think I could see him working with Whoopi Goldberg very well. I think she would be very down with what he does. But yeah, he said this about a number of different, because he's been offered a couple of Hollywood movies. He was also offered Brokeback Mountain in the aughts. And when he talked about Brokeback Mountain, he said, they're like, why'd you turn it down? He goes, oh, I loved the story. I was familiar with it. I'd love to make it. I just got the sense I wouldn't be able to do what I wanted to do. And, maybe this is something that kind of led to him and Carmen just having that breakup. That just, he has his way, he wants it a certain way, and he doesn't want to deal with other people. So he has Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, which was his last film with Antonio Banderas until for another like 20 years. Antonio Banderas also got a lot of attention in his films, and he ended up going to Hollywood, which, as Pedro put it, oh, it broke my heart. He had High Heels. He had Kika, which I think Kika is still his most controversial film. The Flower of My Secret, Live Flesh, which is Penelope Cruz's debut, and then All About My Mother. In 1994, he's talking with Filmmaker Magazine. He says, I don't think I'm going to change in a very radical way. I still deal with passionate characters, very free women, and there still will be color in my films. Yes, there will still be sex, but it's more of a change of attitude. My outlook will be, yes, less young, more mature. And his films did get a little bit, not a little bit, but a lot darker, a lot more contemplative. Flower of My Secret, you're dealing with a woman who just feels very neglected and unfulfilled. There's still comedy in it, but it's like, oh, this is a lot more serious. It's more the seeds of maturity and darkness that you see in films like Laws of Desire, you see come to fruition in the 90s. And Kika Tie Me Up was controversial just because it was given an X rating in the United States, which is associated with pornography. And more importantly, if you're trying to distribute a film, that leaves out a whole lot of theaters because there are many theaters that will not carry an X, much as many theaters will not now carry the NC-17 rating. Kika was criticized because it is a comedy, which also has some Hitchcock thriller elements, but there is a rape scene in there, which a lot of people felt it crossed the line into bad taste. And I think now even Almodovar is kind of like, yeah, I don't think that's my strongest film, and I don't think that was done very well. Um, but it's still, I would say it's still worth watching for other performances. I would never say it's not worth watching, but there's a reason even he thinks it's not one of his stronger entries. And the 90s are also a time where his films are not being incredibly well received. So High Heels, Kika, Flower of My Secret are all kind of lukewarm. Also, Pedro had a great story about how Susan Sontag, who was a fan of his, talked to him about the title, The Flower of My Secret. She goes, "Oh, you shouldn't have named it that. That title makes no sense." So there have been some reevaluation on all of these movies, but at the time they were kind of seen as like, ooh, is he losing his touch? And then in 1999, All About My Mother comes out, and it is still considered to be his best film. Oops, someone trying to get in. And again, I would say if you're wondering where do I start with Pedro Almodovar, I would say start with All About My Mother. It's one of his best movies and a very good encapsulation of his ability to balance drama, tragedy, and comedy all in one film. And again, just look how colorful it is. Again, I'm with you, Todd. I want an Almodovar home. I don't know if I go with all the brown, but look at all the color, look at all the patterns. There's so much life in just this one screenshot. So this wins 6 Goya Awards, won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. I think it still might be his most decorated picture. So this movie is about a single mother played by Cecilia Roth. Her son dies in a car accident, and she decides, I'm going to seek out my son's father, who is a transgender woman. So in her quest to find her son's father, she finds her old friend. She finds the actress that her son admired. She finds a pregnant nun played by Penelope Cruz. And it's how all of these characters come together is what is so beautiful and fulfilling for this film. So I mentioned earlier, The Flower of My Secret, if you go back and watch that, there's the film's Flower of My Secret starts with a film being made where these characters are this actress is reading the part of a woman whose son died, and then there's two medical examiners telling her about organ donation and what happened. And that was the genesis of this film. And it's still, I think, to this day considered to be Almodovar's best movie. And I think it is. It's a beautiful film. I highly recommend seeing it. But there is also a sadder aspect to this, which is while the film was being made, Almodovar's mother, his beloved mother, was not doing well. And in 1999, when the film was released, she ends up passing away. And with that, we move into the aughts, which I think he does not have the output that he had in the first 2 decades. But I would say, talk about actually including All About My Mother, talk about a great run of films. You have All About My Mother, you have Talk to Her, you have Bad Education, then you have Voltaire and Broken Embraces, which I think a lot of people have finally come around on as to being a good movie. It wasn't well received at the time, but oh well, no, it was well received, just kind of a in comparison to other films, but it's been reevaluated. So, but just yeah, Voltaire, Talk to Her, Bad Education, some of the best movies of his career. Bad Education, I know I say one of his darker films. I might even say it's his darkest film to date. So, I mentioned earlier he talked about really not liking Catholic school and being very disgusted by the act of having to kiss the priest's hand. And he talked about, you know, what we all know about the church now and the cover up of sexual abuse of children. And he said, well, nothing happened to me, but I definitely heard about things and I know people whom that happened to. And that influences Bad Education. really, it's a it might be his most tragic film in my opinion. Great Gael Garcia Bernal performance. Also talking about people who could not work with Pedro again. That was Gael Garcia Bernal. Although, as Pedro put it, it was really more the character he had to play. For him, he's like, "This is too much. I can't do this again." Talked to her won Pedro Almodovar's second Academy Award, this time for Best Original Screenplay. Um, and after like almost a decade of having more female-led stories, both Talk to Her and Bad Education have male leads. And then Volver comes in and kind of really harkens back to his roots, not only his roots in filmmaking, but his roots in childhood. So Volver, if you haven't seen this film, you might have seen the poster, which is just Penelope Cruz's face framed by a lot of beautiful colors. I actually had this poster in college. I knew someone who worked at a movie gallery who's like, "Well, we have one of the posters. Do you want it?" And I'm like, "Yes, I'll keep this in my dorm." Because I saw this movie and loved it instantly. So we talked about how his films do sometimes deal with the past coming back to haunt people and the need to kind of confront past trauma. This is what Voltaire is about. It is literally, the title of this film is called To Go Back. And Almodovar actually said he did not want it translated in the United States. He wanted to keep it Voltaire. He did not, because he felt it doesn't sound the same in English. So once again, we have a film that revolves around very powerful and eccentric and strong women. And not the strong female characters that we think when we think of, say, like Ripley or Sarah Connor, but women who have to keep the household together, keep the family together, keep their head up in insane situations, much like the one in this film. So this is one, again, I don't want to give too much of the plot away, but Penelope Cruz, essentially through a series of events, has to confront her past with her mother, and her mother has to make peace with some of her actions and make peace with her daughter. The mother is thought dead for a certain point of time, and why? Well, that you will find that out yourself. But it is about a film that is about healing. It is about trying to keep your head up despite your trauma. Beautiful ending as well. Also, I had mentioned that he and Carmen Maura had a real falling out after Woman on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. She came back for this. She plays Penelope Cruz's character's mother, Irene. And she and Penelope Cruz work so well together. I should take this opportunity to say now, go watch a Pedro Almodovar film featuring Penelope Cruz. Go watch Volver. Go watch Parallel Mothers. Go watch Pain and Glory. Go watch All About My Mother. You will be so angry at how Hollywood just never knew what to do with this woman other than, "Oh, you're hot. You're going to be a sex pot." And then you watch this and you're like, "This is one of the most talented actresses we have working here. Hollywood couldn't think of anything else to do with her other than you're pretty." And meanwhile, every time she works with Pedro Almodovar, it's like it's the best performance of her life. But seeing both of his two most prominent female muses working together, it is magic on screen. And you look at Common Mora in this and you're like, wow, it's like she never stopped working with him. Sadly, this would be the last time she worked with him again. There was an interview where someone asked her, and she's like, "Oh, he's gotten a lot darker and he's gotten a lot more authoritarian, and I don't like to work with that." And while Pedro didn't say anything, Augustine Almodovar did say, "Well, don't call us, we'll call you." So apparently he took offense to that. Although apparently in 2018 they did reunite for a panel. So I guess it's not entirely bad blood. It really does seem like a lot of this is just professional differences. I mean, Antonio Banderas also talked about working with him, and he's like, yeah, he talks to you like you're a child sometimes in terms of what he wants to do. I was really kind of worried. I'm like, oh no, don't tell me Pedro Almodovar is not a good person. This is gonna kill me. But I guess everything I find, he's just a director who has a really specific idea of what he wants. So going into the 2010s, he starts to experiment a little bit. He kind of works around with different styles and different genres. We have I'm So Excited, which is one of his first comedy in years. And I'm so excited. It's a lot of film. I would put a lot of fun. I would still put it on the weaker end of the Almodovar catalog, but it's fun. It's poppy. I'd recommend watching it. It's just one where you're looking at it up against masterpieces, and you're like, well, what are you gonna do? There's The Skin I Live In, which is Antonio Banderas came back to work with him after about 20 years. I would say Hollywood treated Antonio Banderas a little bit better than Penelope Cruz. Todd, what do you think?
I think so. I mean, in recent years, it's kind of felt like they've stopped figuring out how to use him quite as well. But he had a good heyday here for a
Yeah,
while.
the man's got Puss in Boots money. He's fine. Actually, if anything, I think Puss in Boots says they figured out how to use him. They're like, this guy's great. He's funny. Um, I mean, he kind of struggled a little bit in the early 90s. He had to do a lot of his early English work phonetically. Me because he didn't quite know English that well, so he just basically had to pronounce it similar to what Ron Perlman had to do in City of Lost Children. He's like, I don't know French, just tell me how to pronounce it and I'll say it. But he at least had some breakout performances with Desperado. He was in Evita. He was in Mask of Zorro's his big moment, and then he's in stuff like The 13th Warrior. Whereas, again, as I put it, Penelope Cruz, I really don't think got offered much beyond Pretty Lady. And that's heartbreaking because my God, she's amazing. Um, and he also started to adapt other works. He had adapted one work, which was Live Flesh, but two of the works he adapted, The Skin I Live In was uh, a French novel. Also, if you guys have not seen The Skin I Live In, do not read the Wikipedia page before watching that movie because that movie's insane in a good way. And then the film Giulietta is inspired by the works of Alice Munro. But unfortunately, the thing that really defined this movie, other than yay, he's reuniting with Antonio Banderas, is a financial scandal in 2016. So if you remember the Panama Papers leak, it came out that a lot of politicians and a lot of actors had money stored in offshore accounts. And it turned out that Pedro Almodovar and his brother had $50,000 stored there. And in Spain, they're like, it was basically seen as, oh, you're cheating on your taxes. You're not paying your taxes. And the way it was handled was Augustin took responsibility and he said, well, this was for the expansion of El Desio. The press was not satisfied. The public was not satisfied. All of the press conferences and tours for Giulietta were canceled, and that was the in Spain the lowest grossing film for a Pedro Almodovar movie in a really long time. Since it's hit streaming and disc, it's been I think a lot more well received, but the backlash to the admittedly not great news of the Panama Papers really the film suffered for that. And uh Pedro Almodovar, I think the fact that his brother took the fall, it kind of helped his image a little bit, and he has been a bit more forthright of what he's doing with his money. The film Julieta also had a lot of criticism from people in Spain in that they're like, oh, Madrid doesn't even look like Madrid anymore. And there's this discussion of are his films becoming more bourgeois over the years? But as he's noted, he goes, well, Madrid doesn't look like Madrid is used to. It's lost some of its charm and some of its personality. And that's something that a lot of people have talked about happening in older cities across the world. This idea that um, Todd, what's the wouldn't what was the term that was used in The World's End where they talked about how everything looking the same? There's a term
Oh,
that they used. But basically this idea that as a lot of more local, corporations are getting bigger, chains are getting bigger, they're buying a lot more buildings. A lot of the local color is getting pushed out of cities and getting pushed out of a lot of areas. So a lot of cities are losing their local flavor, as it were. And rather than Pedro and his movies getting more bourgeois, it is unfortunately reflecting a trend that is happening in these cities. But at the end of the decade, this is kind of similar to the end of the 90s, where he had some films that weren't exactly extremely well received, but he makes Pain and Glory and kind of brings both the public and the critics back. So Pain and Glory is probably his most personal film, although I would look at Voltaire as well. I think those are two extremely personal movies, as an extremely personal film as well. But this is kind of filtering his life through his own lens. So Antonio Banderas plays Salvador Malo, which is a Spanish director who's kind of going through a rough time, both physically and professionally. Keep in mind, this was made in released in 2019. What could that professional hard time be? You know what? 3 years after the Panama Papers scandal. But it's him looking at how his choices have in his upbringing affected his present life and career. And it's one where it kind of holds the character of Mallow, and you could look at it as like, well, it's holding Pedro himself accountable as well, and going, yep, I've made mistakes. I haven't been the best person. There are references to him having a falling out with an actor, which a lot of people go like, ooh, this is him talking about his falling out with Carmen. It also has Penelope Cruz kind of playing the stand-in for his mother, and it actually, her character has moments where she's reading letters aloud to other people in a rural village. Great performance by Banderas, actually, and it garnered him an Academy Award for Best Actor, which is, I think, might be the first for a Spanish-speaking performance, which, again, we talk about representation at the Oscars. The fact that this took that long is saying something. And again, another, I would say, a really good film to watch. But it's one where if you have not seen a lot of Pedro Almodovar's movies, it probably will not play the same way as it would if you followed his career a lot more religiously, like I have. So this decade, we're seeing him branch out a bit. The top images from Parallel Mothers. I would say really good film. Highly recommend everybody see it. But he has started working in English language films. So I'd referenced The Human Voice earlier, which is a film he did with Tilda Swinton. That is a short piece. He made it in 2020. Which, hey, you know what? It's only starring Tilda Swinton. So hey, talk about a movie you can make during a pandemic. It's one cast member and that's it. Sadly, she lights a really nice Almodovar apartment on fire in by the end of that made me sad. I was like, no, I love that apartment. Don't destroy it. We have Parallel Mothers in 2021, and we have Strange Way of Life, which came out last year, which is kind of, you could argue, his take on Brokeback Mountain, because it is a Western that explores desire between two men. It's a short film. Todd and I, we saw that at the Coolidge. What was it, late last year?
Yeah, it was like mid to late, yeah.
Yeah, no, which there were a number of people that were a little taken aback by the fact that it wasn't as graphic, but for him, he had kind of said like this was a choice. So he says on Strange Way of Life, he goes, the film is full of these moments that are erotic without being explicit sexually or having to do with any kind of physical nakedness. There's a certain intensity, these pauses that are very erotic and carnal to me. And when we saw Strange Way of Life, it also played with The Human Voice, so we got to see that. But afterwards, since they're both two like features that are about 30 minutes, it then had an interview with Pedro. And I would say go on YouTube and watch any movie of him talking about films, because he's very fun to watch talk. He talks a mile a minute, he talks with his hands, but he talked a bit more about saying like there's more to sexuality and desire than just sex and just the act of sex. So for him, he wanted to focus more on this idea of this passion. And when you watch Strange Way of Life, you kind of see that there is this, these, again, the pauses, these erotic pauses, or even the distance between them, the way they look at each other, that is full of desire and eroticism beyond seeing the act of sex. So I actually tell people, like, if you want to see a different kind of erotic film, Strange Way of Life is a good example of how to do that. And he had been trying to make an English language film for a while, and that would have been a Manual for Cleaning Women of Cate Blanchett, but that for him, he fell apart, and he says, quote, because the movie was a Spanish production, um, I would have been forced to recreate many of the American scenes on a soundstage in Madrid, and the process was demanding. And he's just like, well, I gotta micromanage it. And he just said, it frightened me, and I just had to write Kate to say I couldn't do it. Which I'm angry. We're not going to have Pedro Almodovar with Kate Blanchett. However, they are both alive and well, so there might still be time. However, he is going to make uh, a full length English language film, and that will be The Room Next Door, starring Tilda Swinton and Julianne Moore. I am extremely excited for that because those are two of my favorite actresses, and he's one of my favorite directors. And he is going to be publishing a book called The Last Street, which is his fiction debut. Kind of because he's also said there's a mix of memoir in there and nonfiction as well. And I find this interesting because he talked about early in his career, he actually wanted to be a writer at first, and he's like, I just couldn't figure out writing novels. So it looks like he's finally threaded the needle on that, or maybe he's matured to the point where he's like, all right, I can do this. So I will be looking forward to that. And if anyone wants to know what to get me for Christmas, Pedro Almodovar's The Last Dream. So I did just want to give a shout out to a lot of his collaborators in his films, or his people who keep coming back. This isn't a list of all of them, but these are some of his most prolific actors and actresses. So the woman who's been in the most of his movies is Rossi De Palma, who you can see in the top right. She's been in 9 of his movies. That's a kind of like, that's why I go back to the fallout with Carmen Maura may have just been they just didn't want to work with each other anymore, and their styles clashed, because there's a lot of people who kept coming back to them. Chuz Lampriev, she worked with him pretty much until she died. Julieta Serrano, she's a lot older. I think she's passed on as well. She worked with him almost up until the end as well. We have Antonio Banderas, who took a hiatus to go to Hollywood, but he's gone back to Pedro twice. I've actually noticed Antonio Banderas, same with Penelope Cruz. I'm seeing them turn up in a lot of Spanish movies now, and I think that's just because they're like, yeah, Hollywood doesn't have a place for me anymore. I may as well just go back to Spain. You know what you're doing here. Cecilia Roth from All About My Mother. Penelope Cruz, I assume she is going to do more than 7 movies with him. I think she's going to come back a bit as well. But I love seeing Rossi De Palma in his films, because she has I think he described her face as she looks like she's out of a Picasso work. But he never plays her up as, oh, she's the ugly girl in movies. In Woman on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, she's like the blushing fiance. Sometimes she's comedic relief. In Laws of Desire, she's a talk show host, versus I could see in America someone who looked like her being used as a punchline. And I love that he never really does that with her. He just, again, he lets his actors just play characters rather than just being caricatures. And a parting thought from him, this was just one that I really liked and I thought stood out, where he says, films are understood anywhere. They transcend place. The only thing which is of any interest is that films have a personal seal, that they have their own moral, their own point of view, their own mentalidad. And that is what distinguishes you for the rest of directors. And that is what pits Pedro Almodovar apart from a lot of other directors for me, is like a lot of directors I love, he has a very distinct voice. He is an auteur. If you see a Pedro Almodovar film, you know what you're going to get with a Pedro Almodovar film, and yet you will still be surprised because you're like, wow, I didn't see this aspect coming. He is one of those directors where no matter what the film is, I always love discovering a new work. And if you've never seen any of his movies, or you've only seen 1 or 2, I hope you enjoy discovering his work as well. And with that, does anyone have any questions? Not the share. Oh, I said the which one is she? Oh darn. I don't know what that was in relation to. So does anyone have any questions, or a where should I start, or does anyone have a which one to avoid? Because I would say, yeah, Kika is probably his most divisive film. Also, oh, the one with the 4 girls sitting together. That is Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. If you're looking for Carmen Maura, she is the one most to the left. Um, I again highly recommend. That's a great performance from her. Carmen Moore is also really. I cannot talk about Laws of Desire enough. That was another one I hadn't seen before, and she's fantastic in that. She's got such a fun, flirty air to her. Oh, do we have any movies of his in the library? We have a number of his movies in the consortium, and we have we in Derry we have All About My Mother, we have Pain and Glory, and we have Parallel Mothers. I think those are the only three we have of his. In the library, we have Laws of Desire, we have Flower of My Secret, Someone Has Voltaire. I don't think anyone has Bad Education, which is a shame, but a number of his movies are on streaming. So I definitely recommend seeing them there. Oh no, someone has talked to her as well. I was actually very shocked to find that The Skin I Live In is nowhere in the consortium, and I might need to ask Jess to order a copy because I'm like, oh, someone needs to see this. Because again, Todd, did you see The Skin I Live In, or are you kind of
As we've established, you pretty much know everything of his I've seen at this point.
okay? All right, I didn't know if I subjected you to that one yet or not. But yeah, the way The Skin I Live In. Oh, someone Alina said started with Women on the Verge and never stopped. Yes, that's kind of where I am with All About My Mother. I just became a, as a teen, I'm like, this guy is cool. I need to see more of his stuff. But yeah, the way The Skin I Live In develops, I did not see that ending coming. I did not see that twist coming, and I had my jaw on the floor. I was like, this is nuts. I love it. It's a horror movie, but it's a different kind of horror movie. Also, it takes a lot of people thought this was a remake of the older film Eyes Without a Face. It is not. It takes a lot of visual cues from it, but it's not a direct remake of that. Um, but yeah, so yeah, I would say we at least have All About My Mother. Highly recommend seeing. Um, the consortium also has Giulietta and Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. So we're able to get that. I think I remember seeing Pepe Lucci Bon on archive.org. I think someone just uploaded it on there. Oh, I have about 20 VHS tapes. Is that too many? Kevin, I don't think so. I think someone at Red River will take it. But yeah, I'm glad people came to this. I was super excited to talk about this guy. I think he's a great filmmaker and again, just yeah, like Martin Scorsese, like John Waters, like a director I'm going to talk about eventually, Agnes Varda. I have such respect for these directors who will work who just even after decades and decades of working, they are still finding ways to surprise me and push their boundaries as a filmmaker. That's always wonderful. Actually, just before we go, I want to talk about a couple of our upcoming programs. So next month, I'm going to talk about Roland Emmerich, the king of the disaster movies. Maybe I'm going to try to make that case. No one blows up stuff like he does. In August, Todd and I are going to collaborate on a presentation. So you want to get into Japanese cinema. Where do I start? Because that's a real big catalog to go through. In September, we're going to talk about labor on film, how certain jobs and labor organizing is portrayed in movies. I figured that's a good subject for Labor Day. Um, in November, Todd and I are going to collaborate again for Shakespeare on Screen. We're going to talk about the Bard on film. We're probably going to have to limit it to English language cinema with a few exceptions because if we go worldwide, we'll be here for 3 hours. And then in December, I'm going to talk about this 1999 in retrospect, because that was a watershed year in film. A lot of very well-renowned and iconic films came out there. And you might be wondering, Liz, you skipped October. Well, why are we doing that? Because Todd is handling October. And Todd, would you like to talk about folk horror?
Oh, well, we're getting into fall. Suddenly it seems like a good idea to go back into the woods and maybe not. We're going to be going into the sometimes hard to pin down, but very distinct when you find it genre of folk horror. It's like ancient beliefs, witchcraft, cults, old legends. It's all there. We're going to be going through it from The Wicker Man to Midsommar and all points in between.
Midsommar, one of my favorite movies of the past decade. People always get so disturbed when they're like, "Wait, Midsommar is one of your favorite movies?" Oh no, Todd, are you okay? It's that and Gone Girl when I mention that everyone just starts to go like, "Todd, blink twice if you need help." But yeah, those are the programs for the rest of the year. I hope to see you for Roland Emmerich. Mainly just so you can hear me talking about how Independence Day is the only movie you should watch on July 4th. And since that show is after, I am going to hope that you've all watched it for Independence Day. So with that, I will bid you all good night and I will see you next month.